For me, a life-changing, liberating intervention started with an assignment in 9th grade English. The assignment was to report oral history about my small town. This was a small town in Pennsylvania. We were to persuade elderly citizens to tell us stories and dig into the files of the Bangor Daily News to check facts whenever possible. Our teacher, Russell Baggett, had us reading the Thornton Wilder play, Our Town, at the same time. And it was no great leap for me to decide it would be fun to write a play about my town in our town's style. I shyly showed Mr. Baggett the play one day after school. He surprised me by suggesting that we actually cast the play and produce it. His friend, the equally new music teacher, Robert Cathcart, could weave in some music, he suggested. My play had the town mayor as its lead character, and Mr. Baggett suggested I take the role. I quickly said yes, but playing the role turned out to be much more difficult than I expected. In my play, the mayor is seen making a campaign speech in which he gets to extol the virtues of small-town life. In that role, I needed to play a confident leader who manages an entire town. An invisible chorus of voices arose within me. You can't do that. I was a working-class boy. I said it earlier in the book. My ambivalence became visible when Mr. Baggett put me on a soapbox to make my speech. I was a robot, a tin man with no grease. I stood with my arms pinned to my sides as if by a straitjacket. I was in the throes of adolescent awkwardness anyway, to be sure, but even worse was the fact that the script called for me to represent the most lofty position in my town. When Mr. Baggett suggested an expansive gesture to me on the box, I simply turned red with embarrassment. I had no idea what to do with my arms. Poor Mr. Baggett had on his hands a hopeless case for a mayor. During one evening rehearsal, when Mr. Cathcart was on hand to help with the music, Mr. Baggett released the rest of the cast early in order to focus on the mayor's part. Mr. Cathcart stayed, probably hoping to build my confidence. They ran me through a scene I found easy. We then turned to the dreaded stick upon a box routine. I started blushing even as I pulled the soapbox from the wings. Mr. Baggett explained needlessly the importance of my playing the scene as a stereotyped politician, exaggerating the inflection in my voice and my gestures as well. I stood on the box and launched into my portrayal of a heron with its mouth stuffed with peanut butter. I could see past the footlights well enough to see Mr. Baggett sitting beside Mr. Cathcart in the 4th row give a sigh. George, Mr. Cathcart began, you've often stood in chorus performance and really belted it out when we needed a crescendo. I wonder if you could try that now. I tried, unsure that they could even hear me in the 4th row. My projection was turning into rejection. Mr. Cathcart gave a genuinely warm smile. Try a deep breath, George, he said. Now another, and another. Mr. Baggett sat up a little straighter. With your right arm, try pointing toward the wings. I managed to do that. Pointing toward the wings I could do. That's where I wanted to be. Excellent, beamed Mr. Cathcart. Try the other arm. As the sweat soaked my armpits, I followed instructions to point in a variety of directions. I was miserably pessimistic. Could we convince the audience that the mayor could win an election based on his skill in doing semaphore signals? Mr. Cathcart started to crack jokes between each of my tries at saying lines. He somehow avoided ridicule, simply managing to be funny. I found myself laughing, big belly laughs, standing there on the soapbox, eventually with tears running down my cheeks. Mr. Baggett then encouraged me to say my lines while laughing and gesticulating wildly, which made me laugh all the more. Sometime in there, my shoulders stopped hurting and the stomachache went away. Know what? Mr. Cathcart said. We need to knock it off for the night. If you want to, you can just make your entrance again and just do the speech so we can go home. I nodded, walked to the wings, still giggling, turned, and strode back to the soapbox. I ran through my lines and gestures without thinking about either one, eyes focused on the last row of seats. I looked down at my teachers, who were smiling broadly at each other. Let's go home, they said. It wasn't until a decade later, in 1962, that I fully realized the impact of those teachers' patient work with me. President John F. Kennedy and Russian Premier Nikita Khrushchev had begun their duel over the Soviet placement of missiles in Cuba, which were intended to defend Cuba against another attack that the United States was believed to be planning in its ongoing campaign to overthrow the Cuban government. Kennedy threatened nuclear war over the missiles, and both countries' armed forces were put on high alert. With the world on the brink, time seemed to stand still. Public anxiety was extreme. My mother told me that in a beauty parlor in my town, a woman threw up and had to be helped home. I was then a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania, and on campus I saw many anxious faces, haggard from lack of sleep. Students walked around with transistor radios on their shoulders, listening to the latest news of the crisis. They didn't know whether to bother to study, considering they might be dead before the next exam. Although some peace movement leaders were urging demonstrations and letters to the White House, I reasoned that such protests were pointless, because the decisions were being made by two very small circles of insiders, leaving out even the US Congress and the Supreme Soviet. I thought it an ironic symmetry. When a decision mattered most, democracy was as irrelevant in the United States as it was on the other side of the Iron Curtain. Well, I saw citizen action directed toward our government at that moment as a waste of time. The crisis still provided a teachable moment. After all, the two Ks might not destroy their countries just yet, and we citizens might as well learn something from this occasion when the word defense was being made a mockery. I jumped up on a low wall across from the student union and began to speak, waving my arms as if they were actually connected to my heart. I projected into the plaza my indignation that we were reduced to the role of spectators while our leaders played chicken with our lives. First dozens, then hundreds of students and faculty gathered, some of the students in the uniforms of the Reserve Officer Training Corps. But you can't trust the Russians, a student said. Relieved to get a response, I warmed even more to the occasion. You can't trust the Russians, the man said. I repeated loudly to the growing audience, and I agree that leaders of our nation states can't be trusted. All the more reason why we shouldn't allow them to participate in a game where the stakes are civilization itself. We pay our taxes for a defense system, not a system where we are hostages put on the line to try to manipulate good behavior in our enemies. Immediately, another listener in the crowd raised an objection. And slowly but surely, the debate turned into a town meeting in which participants were expressing a variety of points of view, including my own, and I was the facilitator. 3 hours later, I was exhausted and badly needed the bathroom. When a particularly loud participant claimed the attention of the crowd, I quietly got off the wall and walked into the student union. I relaxed, ate a sandwich, read the paper. Finally, I strolled outside to see if anything was happening. Hundreds of people were still crowded together, debating, while some conversations were happening at the edges. I listened in for a while, a smile on my face. We might be dead in a day or two, I thought, but at least we're looking more like classical democratic Athens than this, a nation of panicked sheep. As I walked home to supper, I remembered 9th grade and my teachers, Mr. Baggett and Mr. Cathcart. For all I knew, they might now be appalled by my politics. But still, I thought they would feel some pride in the loving attention they had given me that night in the school auditorium. They helped me gain some relief from the internalized sense of inferiority that can keep me and other working class people from speaking out in a confident way. My sense of power came with grace. I had sufficient flexibility, so I didn't need to control the space. Real democracy values many voices speaking up. I wasn't reactive, overcoming the diffidence of some in my audience by leaping to the other pole, which is domination. I really value equality. I could be a facilitator, trusting that crowd to continue in the mode of speaking out and listening in turn. On another occasion, I might act as an organizer, using a crisis moment in a more strategic way to do movement building. But in October 1962, I was instead marking a life of learning, honoring my high school teacher's coaching in a historic moment on an Ivy League campus. When people support each other to get in touch with their inner power, even those of us who carry internalized oppression because of our class background or our racial background or because of sexism, even those of us can put it aside to answer history's invitation to act. Fast forward to Vietnam era. How many of you remember the Vietnam era? I mean, I know some of you remember the Cuba connotation, right? But you remember the Vietnam era, right? Yeah. A few high school students, inspired to be activists, asked Friends Peace Committee, which I was the leader of at that time, a Quaker outfit, for training. And youth worker Michael Yarrow agreed to organize a summer project in 1964 called Students for Nonviolence. I shared with Mike the view of longtime activist Charlie Walker that one of the most empowering activities for arousing a movement is street speaking. Where did that come from? Mike agreed to try it out, but said I would need to sell it to the teenagers. When meeting with the high schoolers, I told them that Malcolm X developed his movement by speaking on the street corners in Harlem, and that Alice Paul did the same for women's suffrage in the early 1900s in Center City, Philadelphia. The teens were both scared and fascinated, and agreed to try a series of street meetings. Mike assured them that we would first practice before we went out on the street. Each Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, we took a milk crate to the same spot across from City Hall, and the students took turns standing on the box and talking about Vietnam. That happened to be a spot where there was a tremendous lot of pedestrian traffic. The students knew little about Vietnam at the start of the summer, not unlike most members of Congress. Study was essential, but our pedagogy was far more lively than a classroom's pedagogy. I told the students they would be studying in dialogue with the people. Early in the summer, our students were easy for passersby to stump. What gives the North Vietnamese the right to invade the South? What about this Geneva Accords? Didn't the Accords give the U.S. the right to be there? Mike and I loved watching the students dive into scholarly books and articles to learn more and figure out their own positions on the controversies raised on the street corner. The mainstream mass media were of little help. As usual, in the beginnings of wars, the mass media simply parroted the government line. They later would do the same on Iraq. In the beginning of the series of street meetings, Mike or I broke the ice by being the first speaker. Then each of the students mounted the milk crate. Several said it was the scariest thing they had ever done in their lives. As I watched their power grow, I realized that street speaking was the activist equivalent of a high ropes course in Outward Bound. Terrified, right? And then, oh my gosh, I'm actually doing this. After a couple of weeks, students began to volunteer to be the first speaker. The students designed a leaflet to hand out that had a coupon on the bottom and were delighted to find an increasing number of bystanders sending in checks, asking how to volunteer, and telling us they were recruiting friends to come to our street corners at the end of the day. The students realized that on the street, they encountered many people who wouldn't go to a church basement or a union hall for a meeting on Vietnam, but would stand for an hour on the street, learning and discussing the issue with strangers. Midway through the summer, after a turn on the milk crate, I found a spot in the middle of the crowd to listen to a student take a turn. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a hard-faced man edging closer to me. I couldn't miss the tension in his body language. When we were almost touching, he turned to face me and looked down. I followed his eyes and saw he was holding an open knife next to my belly. "I'm on leave from Nam," he said quietly. "Fuck you." I took a breath and looked deeply into his eyes. "I know you can hurt me," I said, "but first, take a minute to think about the consequences for you." He blinked, then blinked again. He slowly put the knife back in his pocket, edged his way out of the crowd, and was gone. I imagine there are a number of stories like that from you folks. Moving forward again, 1989. In early 1989, the United Mine Workers of America, UMWA, called to ask my help in training for their next big coal strike. The labor union world was hearing about my training skills, and miners have had a record of especially tough fights. Both of my grandfathers were slate miners their entire working lives, as well as my dad. I decided to dedicate this training opportunity to my 75-year-old dad. Certainly, the mine workers facing a challenge. The coal companies had agreed among themselves before their upcoming round of contract talks with the union that one of their number would refuse to come to terms. The Pittston Coal Company would dare UMWA to strike them. So the coal industry would test the strength of the workers and see if the companies could retake the offensive in their never-ending war with the workers. The union leadership knew it had to up its game, which meant eliminating or at least reducing the casual violence by workers that in the past had weakened them. All the union members were sent video recordings of the Academy Award-winning film Gandhi. How many of you have seen that film? It's an old film. Yeah, wonderful film. Yeah, so the union sent all the workers that movie and asked them to watch the movie with their families, which was, I thought, very smart. The union wanted a vigorous nonviolence training program, and they wanted to know if I would train the union's field staff so the staff members in turn would train the workers. I met with 6 executive staff of the union for the interview around the table in the union's boardroom. Midway through the interview, we got sidetracked by one of the men picking up an argument they had been having, which was whether in the course of the struggle it might make sense to occupy one of the mines. One faction believed it would send a shockwave through the labor movement, which had not seen major occupation since the 1930s, and would therefore garner additional support. The other faction said the legal consequences would bankrupt the union. After listening for a while, I interrupted by suggesting they consider what had happened in the coal mines of Soviet Siberia. There, when the miners struck in a couple of the mines, the bureaucrats in Siberia were shocked and didn't know what to do. They asked for instructions from their higher-ups, who, in turn, asked their buck all the way back to Moscow. By the time the question reached Moscow, the entire coalfield was on strike. And it was too late to try to repress the strike with violence. Moscow acceded to the miners' demands. I noticed the people at the table leaning in. One suggested, we could choose a mine that crosses state lines, so the two governors would need to be consulted before forceful action could be taken. That would give us time. Another added, maybe we could seize a mine knowing we'd stay only a couple of days, then come out and declare victory before they even got around to arresting us. I got the job. The weekend included intense role plays with equally intense debriefs. I was working with 40 staffers who knew that the stakes were really high. During a break, I chatted with the director of the field staff who told me, George, I went into the mines as a teenager, and I want to be honest with you, workers my age enjoyed the violence that went along with the strike. Thing of being underground most of the daylight hours when you're a teenager. You look forward to the chance to get strike pay and be above ground harassing the scabs and fucking up whatever machinery you can. The violence was a relief, man. He smiled with the memory and took another swallow of coffee. Those were the days. But as much as I prefer the way we did the strike then, I know it doesn't work anymore. So, go ahead, teach us this nonviolent stuff. We need to win. When the strike was called, it was multidimensional and extended. While there was some throwback violence around the edges, the workers maintained a remarkable degree of discipline, reinforced by women from the mining towns, joining picket lines and participating in the fight in other ways. Women, I know, didn't have the masculine conditioning for violence that men have in general and are more likely to do what works. In the end, the union did use the tactic learned from my Siberia story. They occupied a mine as a short-run tactic. When, after a few days of occupation, a flatbed truck pulled up to the mine entrance in the evening with union leadership and a band, plus celebrities, the media arrived in full force. Floodlights played on the truck, illuminating the music and speeches. During the event, the miners occupying the mine stole out quietly, circled around the back of the truck, then emerged suddenly into the floodlights declaring, "We won!" And the union, in fact, did win. I called the UMW headquarters and asked a key official about the role of the mine occupation. No doubt, he said, the occupation was one of the factors that tipped the scales. For me, it was a reminder that trainers and everyone else can be more useful for strategy when we do our homework on what it is that other movements have done that helped them to win. So, yeah, one reason I believe so much about in doing the homework from other movements, it was showed up in my book How We Win, which is about 5 years ago or so, because that's just full of lessons from other movements that have been successful, and also some that failed and why they failed. And I'm just so eager to share a perspective that might be useful to you in this very long-term campaign that you've been doing. Extraordinary. I wouldn't be surprised if it's the longest campaign that anybody's doing in the whole United States. Just add it, a campaign. First of all, you're totally right to be doing a campaign. Dr. King wrote that it became very clear to him very early that these occasional sort of spasms of protest, yay, blah, 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 surging into the street, don't do anything. They're really useless. That what matters is campaigns. So you're totally right in King's view and mine, that it is campaigns that give us the chance to win. On the other hand, obviously, there's no guarantee that campaigns will win. Right? So Dr. King, for example, after they lost in Albany, Georgia, they lost that campaign. It's called a major conference, and they spent the weekend figuring out, why did we lose? How did that happen? Because we won the Montgomery bus boycott, and the students had won bus, what do they call it? Lunch counter campaigns over and over and over and over, right? And other bus boycotts were launched and won. And so they were kind of on this winning streak, and then boom, Albany failed. They figured it out and took that lesson then with them to Birmingham, Alabama, where in 1963 they won. And that became a national struggle because the President of the United States got involved in settling that one. That turned out to be Roger Blau, President of U.S. Steel, being telephoned by John F. Kennedy and saying, okay, you got to give up. So that was a highly successful campaign, and partly because they learned from the campaign that they'd lost. So this whole idea that, you're so smart to be doing a campaign, because campaigns have that ability, but don't have no guarantees built in, obviously, of being able to win. So I've been cudgeling my brain, my sociological brain and political brain, to look for a perspective that might be helpful to you in terms of how to look at your campaign in some long-term way, okay? And I may be totally wrong in this analysis I'm going to share, but I'll trust you to tell me how wrong I am, or whether it makes any sense at all. So what I did was, having learned in Movement for New Society, we just can't do anything without paper, or at least some kind of visual aid. This is a way I've seen multiple winning movements in many, many countries work themselves out. That they tend to start out with a campaign. And these are movements that are able to actually overcome concentrated national power, which is what you're up against, right? You're up against concentrated national power. So that makes it way more difficult than integrating a lunch counter, right? Or even taking on a bus system in a city or something. You're dealing with the military-industrial complex, which also means dealing with the economic elite, which also means dealing with the American empire. Not exactly a shabby opponent. So it's amazing. So this is a perspective that I have, that you're doing a campaign, and there is another campaign going on, and another campaign, and another campaign at any given time, especially in this period, and there are various decades in which lots and lots of campaigns get generated. And when there's campaign plus campaign plus campaign on the same issue or with regard to the same target, what we get is a movement focusing on that target. Now, often that movement isn't powerful enough to win if it's up against a really, really, really great power, right? So what does it take then? Then it takes a movement consisting of strong campaigns, plus a movement, plus another movement, plus another movement, to create a movement of movements. And it's a movement of movements that, if they're willing to join in a coalition, can actually overcome a government and its elite background. And so in the database that we created at Swarthmore College, we have a number of cases in which governments have been overthrown, including their elite backings, through nonviolent struggle. And it's very often happened in this case. It's the same campaign, each one different issue, right? But no, multiple campaigns on roughly the same issue, so that they develop a movement, you could say a mass movement, and then these different movements that are focusing on different issues, but who have the same target, become a movement of movements, especially if they create a coalition. And with a coalition, they are able to amass enough power to overthrow the economic elite or the top power body that's happening in that particular country. And so I thought I'd share that because to me, as an outsider to this campaign, it just seemed to me, well, okay, so you're one campaign, but there need to be multiple campaigns on nuclear power, right? And on militarism in general. Maybe this would be an anti-military movement.
Nuclear weapons.
Nuclear.
Weapons.
Specifically your nuclear.
Weapons.
Specifically your nuclear weapons. Thank you. So that's what links you to other campaigns that might be anti-military rather than environmental, anti-military. Okay, so that's how. Okay, so that would create, if there were a number of other anti-military campaigns, right, then that would create an anti-military movement that might have some strength. But almost certainly, as far as I can tell, my analysis of America, no anti-military movement, no matter how many campaigns we have, could actually deliver the goods. The power is just too great. So what it'll take would be that being, a movement, but linking up with another movement that also finds its opponent is the American Empire, and the elite-based, the powerful empire.
So climate.
Plus that, and so on, and becoming a movement of movements. So that's down the road. But to me, that would help make sense about why, one campaign can't overcome. But with that kind of sequence, could imagine overcoming. But it's so important that each of these campaigns really develop itself as strongly as it can. And that's why my hat's off to you, that you are persistent and can develop, more and more of a learning curve that enables you to become more and more powerful, even within the constraints of knowing, well, we're not going to win next year, which is what this amazing stamina seems to take into account. So I would love to hear responses to that, challenges to that, so on, and see if that way of looking at your role in the larger porridge makes sense. If you're not willing to be hopeful, this might be hard on you. So I don't know. I want to just warn you, give you a fair warning. If it's really important to be pessimistic, then probably you won't like this. But if hope is okay with you, I'd like to share some. But it came about in a very striking way because it required making the biggest mistake I've ever made in my professional life.
Yay!
Is that good?
Yes.
Oh, that's good. Okay. Yeah. My professional life being as a sociologist, right? So a dozen years ago, I was tracking polarization in our country. And that's because sociologists are obsessed with polarization. In any social system, we want to know how much symmetry is there, how much cohesion, and how much is there fracturing going on, right? So I just automatically do that, right? And a dozen years ago, I was noticing our polarization and thinking, oh, this is trouble. This is trouble. Because I figured, how can we make agreements about making major changes toward justice and peace if we're just fighting each other, right? So that was my assumption. However, at that very same time as I was starting to worry, I was also researching for this book because I was curious about the Nordic countries. How was it that Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland managed to create an economic system that is so superior to ours in terms of deliverables like equality, individual freedom, just all kinds of, longer lifespans, better health, just on and on and on, all the ways in which that is a superior system. And while there were a lot of people at the time writing about Scandinavia, nobody was writing about how did they get there. And I was curious about that because 100 years ago, they were a mess. They were coming here. Swedes were coming here. Norwegians were coming here, starting towns called Paulsbo or something. You see, I'm trying to fit in with my Norwegian sweater. You know, I mean, they were getting out of town because their countries were a mess, right? And now they're top of the charts. So how did they get there? I wanted to know. So what I learned was that their big leap forward happened in the 1920s and 30s, which was the period of greatest polarization for them in modern times. That contradicts completely what I was assuming about polarization. Nazis were marching in the streets in Sweden. Nazis were marching in the streets in Denmark and Norway. And at the same time, communists were busy organizing for the dictatorship of the proletariat. I would call that a difference of opinion. And there was tremendous conflict, right? So I couldn't wrap my mind around this. You know, it was too big a contradiction to my understanding of what polarization did. So I thought, okay, George, you have to figure this out. You can't just live with this contradiction. So keep researching. So I looked at our country, looking for cases of major polarization previously. How about 1930s, the decade I was born in? Nazis were able to fill Madison Square Garden for a rally. They were growing like mad, and other right-wing tendencies as well. It was also the glory period of the American Communist Party. And workers were taking over factories owned by major corporations. There was a tremendous level of conflict going on in the 1930s. And it was arguably the biggest decade of progress that we made in the first half of the 20th century. I'm even more confused. So I leap ahead to the 60s, which some of you remember visibly, right? Well, okay, 1960s. American Nazi Party made a re-entry. A lot of right-wing stuff going on. Ku Klux Klan bombing churches and killing people left and right. And on the left, lots and lots of growth on the left, some of which in California embarrassed me. But anyway, there was tremendous growth on the left. And so and tremendous lot of violence in the 60s, of course, and bombings, so many bombings in the 60s. So, and it seemed to me, the 60s, which sloped over into the 70s, really, was the greatest period of progress that we made in the second half of the 20th century. Whoa, what am I to make of this? So I'm saddled with this big contradiction that I cannot figure out, while at the same time, I was doing book tour through Britain for this book, Viking Economics, because the Brits were fascinated with the Nordics. I think it's resentment. They hate it that the Nordics do so much better than they do, and they like to believe they can do everything better than anybody else. So this was a madly popular book in the Nordic countries, and it's even still alive here. Forbes magazine recently called it one of the 5 best books on Scandinavia. And that's Forbes magazine. I was embarrassed. And the reporter protected his ass by saying at one point in his review of this particular one, well, some readers will be not agreeing with some of George Lakey's points of view, but nevertheless, the book is blah, blah, blah. You know, like that. So you know, he covered it himself, right? I thought that was very funny. Anyway, so I happened to be in a town in England where I was being put up by a Quaker for hospitality, and he was a lifelong artist who had recently changed his art to working with metal. And I was wandering around his house, just struck by gorgeous metal sculptures that were around his house. And I said, man, how do you do this? Metal is so stiff and tough. Like, it doesn't want to do what you want to do, so how do you make it do that? And he said, oh, George, let me show you. Come on, come on, come on. So we go out through the kitchen, into the backyard, we go into his studio, and he proudly presents to me a forge. And he says, yeah, I had to apprentice with a blacksmith to figure out how to make the metal workable, how to make it malleable. So it could be squishy enough so it would do what I wanted it to do. Because you're right, it doesn't want to otherwise. And I said, oh, thank you. You have given me the clue that I needed to wrap my mind around something I'm struggling with. A forge is polarization. Polarization works like a forge. It heats up society. It melts norms. You've noticed norms melting. it makes squishy institutions that have been very solid. Like you've heard some Americans wondering, are we ever going to have another free election? In which the person who loses accepts that. Institutions get all squishy and malleable. Norms melt. And that's why we could make so much progress in the 30s and the 60s. That's why the Nordics could make huge progress in the 20s and the 30s. Now, another thing about a forge that is like what we're going through, because we've increased a lot in the last 10 years in the degree of polarization. Another thing about a forge that's like polarization is that the forge couldn't care less what you make of the squishy, melted, malleable institutions. So at the very same time as the Nordics were doing this breakthrough stuff in the 20s and 30s, the Germans were busy fighting it out and going for Hitler. And the Italians at the very same time were also developing a right-wing movement called the Fascists, and Mussolini became the dictator. Forge doesn't care. Hey, make dictators, make fascists. It's okay. If, on the other hand, the Nordics make social democracy, that's okay with me. I don't care. All I do is heat stuff up. You have to figure out with what to do with that available energy. Because what it does is it moves masses into available motion. So the question is, who gets to them? And how do you work them in such a way as to be able to win? And in the Nordic countries, the Social Democrats knew how to work with the masses who were increasingly in motion. They gave them a vision of an alternative so that people didn't think, well, the only thing that could possibly work is capitalism. No, we have a vision of an alternative. Wouldn't you rather have that? And other things that they knew how to do that did this, actually, that did this. This is what they did. And in Germany, they didn't do this. They had big fights between the left and the right, street fights, which enabled breakdown in society, which alarmed the middle class, which insisted on a solution, even if it was a Nazi solution. So the economic elite stepped in and put Hitler in charge so that things would be under control again and there wouldn't be constant conflict. So the Nordics were smart in using the forge's work. The Germans were dumb in not using the Germans, in fact, playing into the hands through use of violence. And the same happened in Italy. And we were pretty smart. We weren't as smart as the Nordics, but we were pretty smart. In the 30s, we did pretty well. And we did pretty well in the 60s. I think we should be very pleased with what we did. But here's the other thing. So that's one big thing. Maybe I should let you dispute on that for a minute. But I want to really show you where my hope goes. But also, fasten your seatbelt. So one thing we've got is accelerating polarization. My prediction, backed by political scientists who think that polarization is created by economic inequality, is that we'll have more and more and more polarization. In 2 years, we'll have more than now. In 4 years, we'll have more than then. More and more polarization. More and more fighting. More and more, the Republicans are now saying blah, blah, blah. All of stuff is going on. More and more and more of that's coming. Okay, so the things are heating up. But that, I don't think that's the only main thing that's going on. I think the other big thing that's going on is delegitimizing the government. Because climate disasters delegitimize government. Government is expected to come to our rescue. It's expected to head off disasters whenever possible, and then when the disasters happen, at least save us, right? Save the furniture, so to speak. And this is going to be overwhelming. I mean, there are places where it's overwhelming, right? Where the government can't cope. Government can't cope. But in 5 years, the government will be even less able to cope, and in 10 years, that will delegitimize the government. Now, I think political science will tell you a delegitimized government is ripe for revolution. That is the primary condition for revolution, is a government that loses its legitimacy among the masses of people. Ironically, the Republicans are the ones who are making the most of this right now. They are delegitimizing government as hard as they can, right? But the masses of Democrats, especially working class and middle class Democrats, will be also losing confidence, that a Biden or an anybody can see us through massive eco-catastrophes, right? So we are moving, friends, into a revolutionary situation. That's what we're moving into. I'm 85. Am I ever glad I'm here? Because I want to be with Firefly for the nonviolent revolution. And that's what is coming for the first time in our lives. First time that the conditions, Fly and I have been arguing for nonviolent revolution for how long, right? But of course, the conditions have never been promising for that. So, but we've had that as like a posture, a position. I see somebody here has a book in which that's outlined, Powerful Peacemaking or something like that. Is that?
I don't know whose it is, but it's right here.
There it is. Yeah, please hold up the purple book. So Powerful Peacemaking is the book on nonviolent revolution. How to do it in 5 easy stages.
That's from our library here, if anybody wants to.
Is that in the library?
That's in
Oh,
our
great.
library.
The-
Both of those books
This,
are.
this is our library.
Oh, great. Yeah, it's the only book I've seen so far that actually offers a stage-by-stage developmental picture of how nonviolent revolution can happen. And I wrote it very long ago and thought, oh, we're never going to have the conditions for this, but it's a lovely politics to have. And I was wrong, because I think I am going to live, be alive, when the conditions for that become ripe. And this is the early part of that. This is the early part of setting up the conditions for a successful nonviolent revolution. If we have multiple coalitions, see that's the bottom of the page, didn't want to overwhelm you, right? But that, feeding into that, and then several mass-based coalitions that agree now the government is no longer legitimate. We need to think freshly. We need to give up the old environmental and capitalist assumptions that were made and think freshly and new. We develop a new picture of what society can be like and the economy can be like, and that's where we go. So the reason I wanted to share that perspective, and you can have many disagreements with it, of course, but is because it's the most hopeful perspective I've run into. So the last thing I'll do before answering, because I'm so wanting to respond to you, but this other thing I wanted to is sometimes when I say what I just shared with you, people say, oh, George is just this out of control of optimist. He's able to find, a light side to everything. Oh my God. Okay, so I just wanted to remind you that in fact, I cry over the hurt that polarization brings. My family will tell you, they'll see me crying over my granola and reading the morning newspaper. Polarization hurts. Polarization hurts. Broken relationships, right? All kinds of breakage. So I like to use the word malleability, but another way of experiencing it is breakage all over the place. And it hurts, and people are hurt and killed. So that was true in the 30s, that was true in the 60s. People died, wouldn't have in the 50s or the 70s. So that goes along with it, and I just want you to know, in case you're wanting to be too quickly enthusiastic about the concept I've given you, I do realize that there's tremendous pain there. Some people I know say, oh, well, let's avert the pain by doing reconciliation. Let's do lots of conciliation, lots of, building of agreement, oppose polarization that way. Hey, this is way too basic than that. That's like, let's go to the shore and get the ocean to go back, the way it was 10 years ago. Come on, who are you kidding? We are the objects of humongous forces that can't be jawboned away. So, yes, there will be tragedy, and I cry about it. And I get closer to other people about it, because those are the two big things that I know how to do to handle what we're facing. I want to cry a lot, and I want to be closer to people. But the other thing is, if we're going to suffer anyway, which we are, why suffer in vain? Why not suffer and use the opportunity for what it is to make the biggest changes that we can make? So in other words, the goal of this group, which has been really out of reach, I'm getting rid of nuclear weapons, come on, right? So you can't just get rid of nuclear weapons. That requires actually giving up of empire, because it's the empire that is behind the nuclear weapons, and you know that. So, but for the first time, if I'm correct, you folks have your eye on a realistic goal. Because, yes, it will require a nonviolent revolution that removes empire from contaminating our society and frees us as a society to do the rational thing. Oh my gosh. So I see what you folks have been heroes about, working on all this time, at last within the imagination, at least within my imagination, of being able to achieve, if we just keep breathing long enough. Because this won't be quick, right? Doing in the empire, the entire economic elite unites on that. They love empire, right? So doing in the empire is obviously not going to be a 3-year campaign, but having a map like this then starts helps me anyway to get a perspective on, okay, if we do this well, have several coalitions that agree, oh, it's the empire that's in the way, and that will enable us to get rid of weapons and this and that and this and that, then we have we can offer this.